Hi, I'm Victoria Stevens, and welcome to our podcast, Stock Exchanges. In my day job working as a fund manager at Lion Trust, investing on behalf of our clients in UK stock market listed companies, I'm fortunate enough to cross paths with some of Britain's most inspiring entrepreneurs. It's a huge privilege to sit across the table from the people who have put their heart and soul into growing and running these companies. And in this series, I want to share that privilege with you, our listeners. Today, I'm joined by Debbie Bestwick, a 35-year veteran of the video gaming industry. Now, Debbie's beginnings in the industry were somewhat inauspicious, with a summer job selling video games at her local shop when she was just a fresh-faced teenager. But she ultimately went on to much greater things, co-founding and growing Team17, a publisher of independent or indie video games. And the company was originally best known for creating the wildly popular game Worms in 1995, a game so successful that the franchise is still generating sales for the company even 3 decades on. Today, Team17 is almost unrecognisable from those early years. The company went through a management buyout led by Debbie and a stock market flotation, and along the way has steadily diversified its portfolio of published games and expanded laterally into adjacent areas, such as educational entertainment apps for children. Debbie remains on the board as a non-executive director, having stepped down as CEO last year. Debbie, I'm so looking forward to hearing you share your story on the podcast today, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Victoria. And oh, wow, thank you. That's touching. Really nice words there. Much appreciated.
So I think let's start, for want of a better place, right at the very beginning, because like so many entrepreneurs, and as I referenced in my introduction, your way into the business world was somewhat unconventional. As I understand it, you dropped out of school and packed your bags and left home when you were very young. So talk us through how you went from that start to running a business worth hundreds of millions of pounds.
Sure. I think the important thing to understand is, look, I was born in 1970, right? Everybody's aware of the miners' strikes and things that were happening as I was growing up. And I would say my upbringing wasn't necessarily the perfect upbringing. It was quite difficult at times. And I think for most people, we were looking at forms of entertainment. And gaming, for me, I think the first time I played anything related to gaming of any kind was Pak-Man. I was 7 years old, and it was a handheld, and I can still see it was a yellow little thing, and I was sat on my bed playing Pak-Man on that. And I really found myself really engaged with that. And then I think at 10 years old, Space Invaders took over my life, right? Sorry, they were monetizing me then. I was putting, they were 10p's back then, not pound coins like they are now, into the machine for Space Invaders. And I knew I enjoyed it. I think at 12 years old, it really hit home. That was the point where, I'm not sure you can legally do it today, but I had babysitting jobs and I was earning some money. And I found myself buying computer magazines that were available. And there was a game that I was playing on my Spectrum. We couldn't afford a Commodore. That was for people with a bit more money, so we had a Spectrum. And it was called Football Manager by a guy called Kevin Toms. And I was completely obsessed. I was buying magazines, entering programming codes. And despite being 12 years old, and I still remember to this day that feeling of this is a form, a different type of entertainment. It's different to, like, books. We all look at different things, whether it's books, movies, music, gaming, as a form of escapism, right? And in how we look to relax in life or whatever we do. But gaming was very different. This was really all-encompassing, all-engaging. And this wasn't even an industry. Nobody, it wasn't really an industry at that point. And I just knew I wanted to do something, but I didn't know how, And so at 12, the first sign was, I know where I want to go. I know I want to be in this industry. I don't know how I'm going to get into this industry. At 16, I left home. I always remember I had one black bag full. It was a dustbin liner that had my clothes in. I was 16 years old when I went out into the world, and I was also in school still. And I also was working in the evening, right? And when I walked out at school, I was doing business. I knew I loved business studies and I was curious in video games. So it was all starting to come together, business, games, etc. I actually applied. I always remember Jessop's, Jessop's the retailer. They declined me, I wasn't 18, and they the people that they wanted to put on their management program to bring through, you had to be 18, and I was like 16, 17, and so they wouldn't accept me. And so halfway through, I took a summer job. My friends all had money to go away. I was not living at home, as you already shared. And I wanted money to spend. So I took a summer job, and it's funny. The choice was, there was two available in Nottingham. One was in a fruit and vegetable shop. Right. The world of fruit and vegetables, I've been saved. I went into video games. The other one was video games, thank goodness. And I also remember I started, I think it was at the end of July. I was due to go back to school in September. Now, the people who owned that game shop actually worked at Rolls-Royce. It was a hobbyist store for them. And they offered me the manager's job. Right. And I just never went back.
And you're still 16 at this point?
Yeah. I wasn't quite 17. And so I took over the store, running it, and I did crazy things. Like at that time, nobody opened on a bank holiday. I opened on a bank holiday, massive trade uplift. I helped them, and it was very much a hobbyist store for them. You could see they weren't overly passionate about what it was, and they'd been looking for a buyer. So I found them a buyer and sold it, and we sold it when I was 17 years old.
And you sold it to Microbyte, didn't
Yes.
you? Which actually plays quite a foundational role in that next chapter of your story.
Absolutely. And so Microbyte were probably what I would call the first proper, some of my friends might, I doubt they're listening to this kind of podcast because it's very different, but there were a few independent games retailers at that time. Microbyte had stores from Oxford Street all the way up to the Metro Centre, but when I joined, they didn't. They were very much a West Yorkshire business. So they bought my shop where I was working, and I smile at it because I swear the plan was to actually get rid of me, close that shop down, move the traffic up to the Bromar shopping centre in Nottingham, which was a big shopping centre. They had a problem; none of my customers would leave, and they stayed. So then they had to take me over to the Bromar shop to do that, and then they realised what they had and offered me promotion, which was like sales and marketing of all their stores. And again, we're talking 17 years old. I think we won Independent Retailer of the Year just before I was 18.
Wow. And then that next chapter was then, as I understand it, that the owner of that shop, Microbyte, then also owned a games publisher, and it was putting the two together and giving you and somebody else a stake that then was effectively your first big break. Or sounds like it wasn't your first big break from what we've heard.
Yeah. So what they had was they had a shareware company. It's public domain software. And, just to give you an idea, this is where companies like Epic came from, who make Fortnite and things like that. They all started in this world. id Software, who made Doom, all of us were in the shareware scheme. And this was like in the 80s. But the owner, he owned Microbyte, the retail chain, but he also owned a public domain shareware company called 17-Bit Software. And he called them 17-Bit Software because at the time we were dealing with 16-bit technology. And his attitude was one bit better than the rest, right?
Catchy.
Yeah. So what they had this retail chain, which was the largest retail chain in the UK. And they had this shareware public domain company, which also had access to all the really good talent around Europe and even in America, that were able to create these amazing demos. And so, he was well ahead of his time, and he looked at it and he went, look, we've got the retail outlet, we've got the talent. Let's start a games publisher. And we've even got the distribution outlet. So it's almost like your own app store to a degree back in late 80s. And so that's where Team17 became formed. And there was three of us that started that. It was Michael Robinson, who was the major shareholder. Sadly, he's no longer with us now. Martin Brown also, and Martin semi-retired, and myself. We were the three. Michael Robinson, he was the money man, and that's where I learned if you're the money person, you get the biggest lion's share of the shares. So he had that. And Martin and myself had around 15%.
Understood. And so when you launched that company, which then became Team17, the first iteration of Team17, how did Worms come about? And I'm sorry to go back to Worms, but it's so well known and it's obviously so foundational to the company's success in those early years.
Yeah, look, Team17, December 7th, 1990 is their official the date that they formed. They had something like 35 titles that were that had all charted in the top 3 chart positions across the UK and Europe on the Amiga market. At one point they had 50% of the Amiga market in the UK. It's crazy. So they were this iconic, well-known company for success of Amiga games that we were launching. And, we used to attend these events like ECTS or trade show equivalents, over in Earl's Court is good, where we used to be. And this kid rocked up to our booth, right, called Andy Davidson. He was a teenager, late teens. And he had this disc in his hand and he went, I'd like to check this out. And it went on, it was put on an Amiga. And I always remember it was Grand National that day. And we always bet on the Grand National because we were always setting up booths and doing things. And Martin, he was always the man who we sent to the bookies to put the bets on for us. And this guy put this on and we were all just looking at it and it looked nothing special. But my God, it was addictive to play. And I also remember, and at the end of that day, so Martin took all these details, and we were definitely interested. And that night we were in a bar and we were like, let's play, because that's what we did. We didn't sit and talk to people. We just played games, right? And we were all playing it that evening, and Martin lost his contact details. So Worms almost never happened, right? To give you an idea. So Martin lost his contact details. Future Publishing, that you'll also know, to run a competition earlier that year for new talent on games. And Andy, who was the creator of Worms, submitted it to Amiga format at that time. And he didn't win, but he came second or third. And they had his contact details. So that's where we actually tracked his contact details back down to do.
And before that point, just to clarify, had you been developing all of your video games IP internally within the company, no. Or were you already taking third-party IP?
Everything was external, and it was very different to Team17's games label. But you'll obviously get where some of the inspiration for our games label came from. They were working with talent all around, and it was, I always remember Alien Breed as an example. Andreas Tadek and Rico Holmes. Rico was born in the UK, moved over to Sweden. Andreas was over in Sweden. They worked on Alien Breed together. Stefan Boberg, who worked on Addictive Pinball. He actually went on to build the DICE engine for EA, and he now works at Epic on the Unreal Engine as well. So these people are super talented people. We just knew them really early on in their careers, and we're working on very, very much the type of games that we really specialised in were arcade games. So if you think about the kind of games that you would play in the arcades, right, they weren't available for the Amiga, so we were making them for those.
And that was your bread and butter.
Absolutely.
And so what was it about Worms that was so addictive? Is it sometimes this secret sauce that's very, very difficult to pin down?
Do you know what? I always say to people, look, if anybody tells you there's a magic book on how to create a great video game, they're lying, right? If that was the case, this industry would have been wrapped up decades ago, and everybody will come out. Occasionally I read it and it's like, oh, we now know the secret sauce to doing this and doing that. Games are games. They're a creative content. The thing is about what made Worms so special was first of all, it was that last man standing and one-upmanship, right, in terms of gameplay style. The zany cartoon humour that we brought to it, very slapstick, Roadrunner-esque, that was very en vogue with the cartoon series that were going off at those times. But visually, absolutely nothing great about it. I mean, I can remember asking about, showing it to buyers in retail. They were just looking at me like I'm crazy, right? And I asked the team to make me some FMV sequences, and they were like, why do we want them? And I'm like, because I need to pull people in on this game. And so, and now they're like iconic in their own right, but it was really just to get people's attention to come and play. But what made Worms truly, truly special, it's a brilliant, brilliant game. It's gameplay. But so many people, didn't win the competition with Amiga format. I remember when we launched it, trying to get buy-in for it wasn't easy. And I think, if anything, it taught me a lot. And a lot of what you see in Team17's DNA today on the back catalogue side in particular, lifecycle management, that was what I learned about Worms. Evergreen title. You're talking about, you said at the start, it still generates revenue today, and it's not insignificant, right? It's still a decent chunk of revenue. Evergreen titles, there aren't that many of them in our industry, and they're the ones that are super important when you look at, even when we go into M&A and things like that, it's always looking and going, will I be playing that though in 20 years' time? Irrelevant of device. Will I be playing that game? Games like Worms, you absolutely will. It's a classic in the industry itself now.
Yeah, it's the classic problem, isn't it, for a video gaming business, because so often they can be one-hit wonders, or certainly the success of titles and when they actually capture the imagination of the consumer is so hard to predict. So you can be, the risk is that you're a bit of a flash in the pan if you have a huge success 1 minute and then actually try and spend the rest of a career trying to replicate that success. And
that's the hard thing, even from an investment point of view, when you're looking at our sector, I always say, the hardest job is forecasting brand new, unknown IP. I think that applies whether it's video games, whether it's movies, whether it's TV, whether it's books, right? Brand new, original IP is incredibly difficult to forecast. However, you can't be afraid of creating that, because where is the future if you are?
Absolutely.
So you have to be brave and you have to be tough sometimes. And it's one of the things that I loved about our label, bring games like Overcooked to market, and my time at Portia and Hell Let Loose. Most people would have run a million miles away from those type of titles, right? But they deserve a place, and you work them. But I think one of the important things for me was, how do you balance risk as a business in video games? Because like everybody, when I came to do our IPO, I heard all the IDOS stories that everybody was giving me from the previous decade. And, people have long memories when they lose money, right? And fair enough. And we came with a very different business and a very different business model, which I still don't think everybody fully appreciates and fully understands. I think when we came to market, our back catalogue was around 58% of our revenue. Look at it today. It's closer to 80%. This is where you remove risk in a business. And everybody focuses on your new releases because they feel that's what they should be focusing on. Nobody's really looking at your year-on-year growth as you're building one. When I did our IPO, nobody was talking about back catalogue and portfolio businesses. Now go and listen to an earnings call anywhere in the video games industry. They're all talking portfolio and back catalogue. We were ahead in terms of what we're doing. And I think that was so important to me. It's how do you build as risk-free a business as you can in a market that can be quite unpredictable.
Well, it's balancing risk-reward over the long term, isn't it? It doesn't entirely get you away from some stock market volatility, because clearly the stock market will be looking for very short-term, all too often it'll be looking for very short-term. Have you hit that number? Have you hit the other number? But actually, when it comes to managing the business on a 10, 20-plus year time horizon, you've got the confidence that it's going to be there and it's going to endure.
And you have to think that way, right? And I think that's the hard parts of being a CEO, right, of a PLC. And, I always look at it. Somebody said to me, you've been private, you've been under private equity, you've been under PLC. And I said, yeah, being private, it's a bit like being Division 1 in the Football League. Being under private equity is a bit like the Championship League. Being PLC is you're in the Premiership, right? That's where you are. You're up there against the best in the world and you have to compete. But it's really, really important as well, to not let here and now get in the way of what creates great long-term businesses, And so even when it's looking at product acquisitions that we've looked at, always looking, is this going to be around in 10 years' time? It's very easy to go out into a market and start spending money on those one-hit wonders that you talk about. You know what? You're not going to be talking very nicely about them in 2 to 3 years' time because they don't have sequel potential. They don't have long-term franchise appeal. And when you look at things, like the Astragon titles that have been added to the portfolio and even Story Toys products that are there, they've all got that long-term evergreen appeal, same with Golf with Your Friends and Hell Let Loose. So you can see very much where our mindset has always come from about this is not about winning now. This is about building long-term, sustainable, evergreen portfolio businesses.
It's so refreshing to hear that because our investment process focuses at the smaller end of the cap scale on investing alongside entrepreneurial founder managers or owner managers who themselves hold a lot of equity in businesses. And I think one reason why we like that is, well, A, the balancing of risk with reward. So we tend to find they're a bit more conservative about how they manage the business to endure for the long term. But also, there's the idea that actually, you want to be more than that short-term story. You want to manage for the long term. You want to make the decisions about investing in the business that are going to set it up for long-term success. And don't worry too much about what happens over a 6-month or a 12-month time horizon, because ultimately that's not what's going to generate you the best returns.
That's it. And I think a key part, is, there's a lot of noise around you constantly as a CEO in a PLC world. And you have to learn to block it out. You have to be, I feel quite grateful on my journey, with the shareholders that have been behind me from the start. They've been pretty good in terms of giving me good advice and going, don't let that get to you, ignore it. You don't need to pay attention, because you're new doing this for the first time ever. And there's a lot of voices telling you how you should do something, you should do that. And you have to really go, you know what, don't lose sight of what you're building here.
Absolutely. And so, can you give us a bit of an insight? We skipped over a little bit of the end of that story that led you up to the float.
Sure.
We obviously talked about launching Worms. What happened between then and the management buyout, which I believe was 2011?
Yeah. Look, so to fast track through some of this, so if you look at when Worms launched, in 1995 through to about 2009, right? Team17 became, and, I always say Worms was a blessing and a curse, and some people have heard me talk about, giving young 20-year-olds, overnight massive success. We learned those lessons very, very quickly. But between 1995 and 2009 in particular, we kind of lost our way a little bit. It was a yo-yo business. The major shareholder had lost interest to a certain degree. And I always remember 2009 very vividly. It was the year my son was born. And I always think there's a pivotal moment when you're going to do something, watch as women, when we're pregnant, we come fiery, and that was a moment for me. I'd only had 2 weeks break when my daughter was born. My daughter was born in February 1996, just after Worms launched. Right, so I had 2 weeks off and she was straight in nursery, not right. When my son was born in 2009, I knew that wasn't going to be the case, and so I approached the major shareholder and I said, listen, I want time off. I want time off to go and spend. I'm not going to have more kids after this one. I want to enjoy that time. They had plenty of money in the bank. They were in a good place. And I think within 2 months, I was getting calls saying, you need to come back to work. This is not right. This is falling apart, etc. And that was the point where it was like, this can't be my life. It can't be my life anymore. And it really became that ultimatum moment. And, and I thought long and hard over this. And so I approached him and it was like, look, I need to do a management buyout here, or sorry, I'm leaving. And I need to, I'd been approached by so many people in the industry trying to hire me and other things. And I turned it all down. And it was that point where now is the time to do it. And so he agreed to do the management buyout. It took me 12 months, painful, really painful, to do that. I ended up buying out both of the shareholders. Martin wanted to go and do free-to-play games. And at the time, there was very little free-to-play games, and we had no skill set in free-to-play. It's like taking us into free-play would have been a disaster. We didn't even know what we were doing there. And so a year to do the management buyout. And my first goal, once I did the management buyout, and I don't mind sharing, this where you go, this is the day where you're in charge. You're calling the shots now, right? Most people would have gone home after completing a management buyout and probably had a glass of wine or poured a glass of champagne and celebrated closing of a deal. I was a nervous wreck. I all of a sudden felt this massive weight on my shoulder. I'm now responsible for all of these people, their families, their children, their paychecks. I always said I was like the reluctant CEO to a certain degree. It wasn't something that I really was there at the forefront. So I felt this massive weight on my shoulder. And it was like, okay, how do we turn this around? How do we turn this around? This is a business that's never had 2 years back-to-back revenue growth or profit in the last decade. So that was target number one, back-to-back revenue growth, back-to-back profit growth. So did that. 2014, had a few people come knocking on the door. Worms on mobile was phenomenal. Number one in 145 countries. So a lot of people wanted to get their hands on Worms for free to play. And, you get the usual, we're interested in the company, but are they really interested in the company? I'd only been running it fully for a couple of years, and I had listened to them, heard them out, but it was too soon. We hadn't even started our journey. And, back-to-back success down and revenue and profits. Okay, what now? It's boring, right? Now it's time to really step it up. And I had a really cool idea. I wanted to, which was inspired by the music industry, the film industry, plus the early 80s career that I had in video games, which was creating a different type of games label, and bringing together people resources to help indie developers. So it's not just about publishing, it's about giving them resources to help them make better games. And I always think, from the music, if you look from the music industry, you can be a great singer, but you're not really going to do great if you've not got a great band, if you've not got great management, if you've not got great tour people, So I saw that area of what we needed to create. And so we started our label in 2014. The Escapist, one of my first games, very special to me. I spotted the game on Kickstarter, tracked him down, signed him. He was a roofer, he's a very wealthy roofer now. But Chris was a fantastic guy, but I needed to prove out the concept. It's no good me just signing a development team that's been around our industry. That's not going to prove anything. I need to almost take somebody off the street and prove that we can do this. So that's what I did. Chris was a roofer. A couple of the guys worked at cinemas. Some other people worked in, not in video games. And it was, how do we turn those games into hits and show how we do that? And so we did that, and we did it quite quickly. And so my CFO at the time had been with me for a number of years, and he pulled me and he said, listen, you've been doing this for a very long time. One of the lowest paid people in the business, just so you know, I was, everything went back into the business, never taken a dividend out. And he said, it's time now to think about something. And I went, okay. And he said, let's look at private equity. And I'd always had my eyes on, I'd like to do a float, like I said, that woman of substance book's got a lot to answer for, Barbara Taylor Bradford, And I thought, okay, let me see if I can manage these people first. How am I going to cope with private equity in the business and monthly management meetings? So it was almost like a test case pre-PLC to test me, to see how I'd cope. And so the company the companies never needed money. It didn't need money at private equity when we brought private equity in. It also didn't need money when we floated on the stock market. It generates an awful lot of cash. That's why the business is such a strong business. So private equity, it was me selling down some shares and taking some money out, and my children starting off their fund to make sure their kids and them are going to be okay on their journey. But I still don't think I was incredibly naive. I think industry-wise, I knew everything about my industry. Nobody could tell me anything. I knew my industry, and I knew more than my industry knew, But I didn't know business management, operational, the whole finance side of things. So it was getting an insight into that. And I think I was quite innocent when private equity came in. I think I turned around and said, I don't want to be involved. I'll only do the final interview, because it was a distraction, which is crazy, right? And everybody, we narrowed it down to a set few. LDC were the ones in the end, and that's only because, we didn't want debt financing. And, any loan note interest, I wanted existing shareholders being treated as an equal, right? It's only fair. But then what we did, we had the following year, so the year from signing with private equity, we had 118% year-on-year growth. And that brought people knocking on the door.
I'm sure.
And I think that was the point where I kind of woke up and thought, okay, these wonderful private equity people probably not going to be with me in 10 years' time, or maybe even 5 years' time. This is now going to be a distraction to what I want to do. And they'd had a few people knock in, and they reached out, and some had come into me, and we had a conversation, and they asked me about selling to a bigger private equity, selling to a trade buyer. But I kept sitting there and going, but I'm still only just starting our business. We're only a couple of years into this games lab, and we haven't really started it properly yet. It's going, but it's not there yet. And I thought, if you sell, I'm just going to end up working for somebody else for a couple of years, and they're going to get all the upside, because all the money people are going to make money and they can go off and reinvest and do whatever. Nobody's going to let me walk, so I've got to deliver. And I thought, that's not right. And so I spoke to a whole bunch of friends of mine. I spoke to David at Frontier. I spoke to Fred at Paradox, Andrew Day. I spoke to Andrew, Martin Halliwell, I spoke to him. I spoke to the guy who was running Jules, which was part of LDC as well. And LDC were really against doing an IPO because they'd had a couple of failed IPOs the previous year. And I was like, I don't care. Right, we can get this away. I know how good this business is, and I know where we're at on our journey. And that was a tough conversation, but then they fully supported me. They got right behind. I can remember doing the IPO, and we oversubscribed by 4 times, I think it was, and it was like, let you guys have a chance now to cash out completely if you want. Not doing that, Debbie. And no, they weren't. They were smart, right? And stayed on the journey. But yeah, it was super fast how fast that all happened.
I'm sure. And it was happening, of course, at a time when your industry itself was transforming very rapidly in terms of the rise of digital distribution, development engines. You've already mentioned Epic's Unreal were being launched. Effectively, I see that as being kind of a dual-pronged, on the one side, almost the democratization of development, and on the other side, a more efficient digital, arguably more repeatable distribution model. But of course, what was happening to those smaller independent developers, I believe, is that it becomes more and more difficult to play with the power of the big distribution platforms. How do you see that shift? What was the importance of that for Team 17's growth story?
So the transformation, so the digital distribution, disruption, and the engine disruption, it started between 2005 and 2009. Different spikes, different things happened. The App Store shook up a lot, on mobile, as you can imagine. But where it made a huge difference, was our industry was pretty closed off to the top tier publishers, and you had a few. I'd been a developer for over 20 years, and I've always said, I've worked with pretty much most of the big players in our industry as a games developer. They were taking less and less risks. So when we talk about those new IPs, they were pretty much not doing any of that. Very little of that was happening. So there was very little innovation happening. So this was a problem within our industry. Also, retail physical goods, most of the margin was going between the publisher and also to the retailer. So to give you an idea, and I'm always told whenever I mention my royalties that we run as a developer, people are like, well, you were at the top end. And I'm like, okay, right. We were at roughly 25 to 30% of receipts, right? Most people were 5 to 10%. And they're the creators, and they're funding some of it as well. So the tables flipped completely when we went into digital distribution, right? It took, by the time we IPO'd, we were already 90% digital in our revenues, right? And which puts it in perspective. But game engines, what game engines did, so prior to Unreal and Unity being around, you had to build your own game engine. And, right at the start, I mentioned my friend Stefan Boberg, who's now over at Unreal. Stefan built the ZOM engine for Team 17, which is what Worms is built on. Oh my God, it's painful, right? Because you need a large team, constant maintenance, constant investment in these, and it's very, it's very focused on specific games to get specific results. Independent, small indie developers can't afford any of that, right? So when the game engines come over, all of a sudden, anybody can make a video game. And we've proven it. A roofer made a great video game, right? People who've worked in cinemas made great video games. We showed how they could make great video games. And that was that's what the engine side brought. You know, in 2008, when we came to market, I spent an awful lot of time even having to explain what Unity and Unreal were. Most people had never even heard of them in London, you know, which is crazy because they've been around for a while. But the retail disruption has been a key driver. And also, you know, and I think where it's really added value, you know, life cycle games, you know,
back to that repeatability of revenues that
absolutely, it's repeatable business, but also, you know, we like Worms launched in 1995. You know, that very same DOS version that launched in 1995 is still for sale today on Steam, generating revenue, right? No longer are we at the beck and call of retail where your game launches within a week, it's slowed down, your markdowns, it's coming back out of stores, shelf space, nightmare. It's a very different world. And so I think we really embrace that. And for me in particular, it was like, I really embraced that and the App Store taught me so much. You know, even though we weren't huge in mobile, Apple taught me so much about what digital distribution was going to become. If you looked at the App Store when there was no free to pay, you know, it was just paid games, you know. And I also remember when Words with Friends and Worms launched, you know, and they were the two highest grossing games on the App Store that year. And looking at how the algorithms were working, it gave great insight to what was coming down the line, you know, and really embracing that. But you're right, a lot of indie developers don't try and figure out lifecycle management. It'll take decades to learn it.
Yeah. And I have to ask, given what we've just been talking about, but obviously there's been a huge furore over the potential impact of artificial intelligence or AI on a whole swathe of different creative industries. Video games has been no exception to that. So, I mean, my question, I suppose, is AI going to kill the developer, or is it going to make the whole industry stronger?
I can't speak for the whole industry, right, because there's different parts. But if I look at it from a creation point of view, I'd like to think it's going to benefit indies more than anybody, you know, because they're the people who are so restricted on resources and tools, right? So tools and resources are all going to be speeded up. So it can give more tools and resources. But also, you know, I am that person that I'm embracing it, right? Well,
it's here to stay, so yeah, I suppose. You know, in a sense, none of us have a choice.
Absolutely. Don't fight gravity, right? But I look at it and I go, there's so many things that it will help and speed up, which we can all benefit from. And I'm not just talking games, just in life. I can't wait for certain parts, right? However, let's not lose originality and creativity, right? And yes, AI, people go, but it's going to be able to do everything. It's going to be able to do this. In time. You know, cookie cutter stuff is not what, you know, if you're going to just be cookie cutting what's going off in our industry, I'm sorry, you're not going to be selling that many games, right? You've got to, you know, there is an element of originality that needs to come through, and some of that can only come from human beings. It will take AI a long time to do it. But I see it as complementing, you know, and also getting rid of some of the painful areas as well, you know. There's some service areas that AI will absolutely benefit, you know. And again, I don't think they'll fully replace people because I think people are needed on the tool side. But imagine QA happening while you're developing.
Yeah.
Think of the time saving. Imagine localization as you're writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the content side, when we've spoken to others, I think there's this sense that the demand for content is insatiable. So in a sense, as you get more and more efficient at producing more expansive content, better content, more content, that is hungrily gobbled up by consumers on a sort of exponential curve that AI can help to achieve.
I'd say yes, but I'd also go, let's just remember we all only have infinite time.
Absolutely.
Right. Let's not get too carried away. You know, I think I saw some of that in COVID. It's like, let's not forget, human beings are the people that are paying for these things, and we only have a set amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot of competition for our time going forward.
Yeah. Now I'm going to take us in a bit of a different direction now, because I think one thing I really wanted to explore with you is your experience of being a woman right at the very top of your industry. You know, there's some obvious similarities between you and video games and our fund management industry. You know, both of those two businesses, or both those two industries, have a bit of a poor representation for the proportion of females at high levels, at the top tier. And there's been criticism levelled at both for being inhospitable towards women at times. There's obviously elements of truth in that. Some of it is stereotyping. But I'm really interested in your experience of breaking that glass ceiling.
It's a strange... So I think my industry has always been incredibly supportive, right, of me on my journey. However, I do feel they've put me on a pedestal higher than any man would ever be put on within my industry. That's not fair, right? And whichever industry, I would say it's not fair. I'm a human being. You know, I'm going to do the best that I can, but I expect to be judged as an equal. You know, not the gap on pedestal. You know, my industry has put me on at times put me on a ridiculously high pedestal. I was the only woman who has run a listed PLC company. You know, I think there's been 2 of them since, you know, but up until last year, I was the only one around the whole world. That brings so much extra attention. Being public, you know, the information isn't always great, you know. I can remember my industry at times all thought I was earning $10 million a year. I'm sure you as shareholders would be having a heart attack if that was my basic pay. So that adds extra levels of pressure that comes onto you. I think when I started the industry, I was very lucky. I've always been more over in the games development side. So I've always hung around with what I would call the geeks and the nerds. And to be totally honest, they were very protective of me on my journey, you know. And I think they've looked out for me, and you know, I still find myself on a even now on a weekly end of Friday call with a friend of mine who's really I've known since I was 17, who's looked after me. So if I've gone to events, always kept an eye out at parties, you know, had people who've looked out for me. That was useful. I think I was worried about it when I was coming to market. A lot of people said to me, it's so hard for female to get investment.
Well, I mean, if I may, you've always made a really bold statement. I mean, our listeners can't see you, Debbie, but you've got trademark purple hair. You're wearing it very long and curly today. And that's always been a thing. And I always wonder, you know, to what extent you were almost proud to wear those differences openly in meetings where, let's be honest, in the city, usually you're sitting in a room full of suits and shirts. Was that sort of almost a point of pride for you?
It's a strange thing, you know. So just to help you, when we were doing private equity and we're after private equity investment, I remember I was getting an award in London the night before I was having a meeting with the private equity people for the first time, and it was the Twitch Awards, right? And it was for Businesswoman of the Year. And my friend came around to cut my hair, and I was like, oh, God, I'm so fed up with this. I've got this meeting tomorrow with these private equity people. I don't want to walk in this room and just have an hour of whatever. I said, I need to walk in, and they need to say, this is creative industry, this is who we are. But my hair was short at that time, and I just did a little bit of the front. My CFO nearly had a heart attack when I turned up the following day, and he saw me. But no, I think when it came to IPO, Chris Bowman at Berenberg, who was at Berenberg, was brilliant for me. I mean, you know, we can talk about many people, but I always remember the Friday before we were doing the test marketing, you know, and I talked to you before, Victoria, about how people try and script up CEOs and to do what they do on roadshows and things like that. I'm one of those people, don't try, it's not going to work. But people did try. They tried. And I can remember on the Friday night before I was going out doing test marketing, Chris Bowman phoned me up and he said, how are you? And I was close to tears. I honestly didn't think I could come into the city and be the person that I was told that everybody wanted. And he was the one who said to me, stop. I've seen you do everything. You are incredible. Be you and turn up being you. Right. And I needed that voice because when you're coming, and this is what a lot of people don't see, you know, when we were getting ready for our IPO, there were 52 people involved. 2 of them were from the company, myself and the CFO. 50 people weren't. And those voices are very loud, you know, and they're telling you how to do things in a certain way. And I will always give Chris Bowman the credit for being the way that he was, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't have done this any other way.
Almost a mentor figure through that difficult new process.
Yeah, just that. You're going into this city and everybody had scared me. I was so scared to even say my name, right? Because, you know, the whole process pre-IPO is very intimidating, right? And, you know, the due diligence is incredibly thorough, which is good. I'm glad it is. But, you know, everybody's like, you're so scared. They scare you so much. And I was like, look, technically my name's Deborah on my birth certificate, but everybody calls me Debbie. Am I okay to call myself Debbie? Because that's how paranoid they make you. But Chris Bowman got rid of all of that for me. And I can remember I needed him for the first meeting on test marketing. After that, he just went, right, I'm off, you've got this, and left me to it. And that's what it was. But also, I think it was a case of, you know, and I think that's something for anybody who is doing this is, you know what, it's okay to be yourself. Don't listen to what other people are telling you.
It's not just okay, it's vital.
Yeah.
Actually.
But they try and, you know, a lot of, like I said, a lot of voices, you know, around you. And, you know, you've got to remember, a lot of people are making a lot of money out of you at IPO, right? And trying to put you where you are. And it's like, no, it's really important to be yourself and just remind yourself of why you're doing this. And he did a really good job. I was so, you know, he left Berenberg last year and huge loss because that guy, anybody I knew who was going to do an IPO, he should be running some, you know, school where we all go to pre-IPO and get a just normality, please, a reality check. He was great.
We have moved a long way, I think, though, on those fronts. I mean, I always remember it was probably 15 plus years ago now, but I started out my career as a journalist. It was only a very short-lived interim job in the end. But I remember somebody had passed on a memo, and I believe it was from one of the big four accountancy firms at the time, where effectively women had been told that they had to come into the office wearing high heels and skirt suits. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, you want to get away from this reputation as an industry for being hostile to women. Well, this is absolutely not the way to go about it. So I think we have come a long way
huge.
Celebrating each other's differences.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, look, I did our IPO and I always remember it was in May and we had a really warm May that year, really warm. And, you know, never mind the hem. My trademark platform shoes were on my feet, which they are today as well. Sorry. You know, and I'd got shorts on and I had, you know, different rock T-shirts and everything else. And, you know, I met, and some of those people are still friends today. You know, I met some of the most incredible people on my journey who just be you. But that also does bring a lot of pressure on your shoulders too. It
does. And one of the things I think is very difficult. I mean, it definitely chimes with me when you talk about your two children and how difficult that was in the early years. But just the challenge of trying to have it all, and I hate that phrase, but have it all with regards to blending work life and home life. And no matter how supportive your team, and mine are absolutely fantastic, I think it's more pressure you put on yourself that makes striking that balance so difficult, because it's so easy to feel that you're doing a subpar job in both areas of your life. So how did you juggle it all? How did you cope with those pressures?
I didn't, is the honest answer. And I don't think any of us do, right? You know, you talk about pressure that you put on your shoulders. I always say, look, nobody puts more expectations on us than what we do ourselves, right? The weight on my shoulders is nobody put more on there than what I did, right? I think the brutal honesty. You know, my son was born in 2009. By 2011, I'd done a management buyout. I attended my first parents' evening this year. He's 15. You know, I had a couple of holidays during that time frame. I gave 1,000% everything that I was, and I'd say to you, I didn't do it right. You know, and I think I had, again, a fully supportive team. But good luck trying to tell somebody who all they want to do is double down, grow, focus, to ease up, take it back. I'm not sure I would have listened to them enough. I think it's what I've learned really important is our children they, you know, especially when you're running a business like what I've been doing and the growth journey that we've been on and the changes that we've done, my kids have sacrificed an awful lot. For that.
And that's been partly behind your decision last year to take that step back. As I said in the introduction, you know, you've moved from the full-time CEO role to a non-executive director role to spend more time with them. I mean, that is admirable. I'm sure you're absolutely loving spending more time with the children, but it's also difficult, isn't it? That moment where you have to hand over the reins.
You want to try telling people it as well, because honestly, men don't do this, right? It's only women who do this, right? And, it's not often that you will see a male CEO. In my industry, a few have come out and said it over the last year, which has been quite interesting. But it really was, I was working 7 days a week, 24/7. And I don't think I was even looking after myself the best that I should have been doing at times. My kids, it's super important. I think what hit me the most, my daughter got married last year. When did that happen? She was born a few months after Worms launched. I shared that at the start in 1996. Where did she grow up? How did that happen? My son, he turned 15 at the beginning of this year. 3 years and he's away. I'm not going to be cool to hang around with my son. My daughter the kids will always come on holiday as long as you're paying, right? Let's be real. But you want them to come and be with you. And I'm not sure. I got to the point where I just asked myself a really serious question. I'd lost a good friend my best friend died in 2021. And I asked myself a question, what is it that my kids are going to say about me when I'm no longer here? Well, she built a great business and we've got a great life. Is that what I really want to be remembered for? No, I also want to be a great mum. I want them to have memories spending time with me going to things with them, going shopping with my son. We enjoy shopping together, and that is just as important. So I think I could have found a much better balance. But again, I think the pressure that I felt being a woman, I felt I had to give it everything. I felt like I had to work twice as hard. A lot of my peers in the industry, I'm like, how can they get 4 or 5 weeks holiday a year? I can't even get a week off, But I think, again, the pressure I put on those shoulders, not what other people were putting on their shoulders.
But in a sense that now that you've got to this point where you have to make that very difficult decision to step back, almost it's almost taken out of your hands in a sense, in that it is a moment where you can really see the positives in stepping back and handing over the reins and relinquishing control, if you like.
Yeah, and look, it's been inspirational to it as well. And that's, something to share is, so hard to think when you're running constantly, right? I was with my son, and my son's naturally curious. He reads our annual report for fun. He must be the only 14, 15-year-old who reads those things, but he reads them because he's curious about all those things. And we have really in-depth conversations about it, but also have the time to spend not only with my children. I take a journal when I'm traveling and I'm writing down and ideas that I didn't have time to do and I want to do. And, and Steve, bless him, I speak to Steve really often at Team17. And I'm like, I've got this idea. This is where, I wanted to do this 3 years ago. And look, I've run the numbers on this and I'm running that. I never had time for some of that stuff. And we lost that opportunity. And so that is much easier. And I think the board is really good. Frank Sagnier has been a breath of fresh air. Frank is very, very good as a people person. He's a good friend too, but he's very, makes me stop, makes me think about things. If I'm not, even in my personal life, he shows an interest. He cares about you as an individual and he cares about people. And it makes me do things. So, yeah, but I think it's been really nice just to sit back and look at the whole journey and go, what would I have done? How would I have done? Hindsight, blah, blah, blah. That's been really refreshing. And I think therapy, it's felt like therapy at times.
I'm sure it has. And so we're approaching the end of the podcast. But one thing that I always wonder is that, being an entrepreneur, growing a business, watching it reach those lofty heights of being listed on the stock market and growing it to be worth hundreds of millions of pounds, as we said at the beginning, that is probably right up there at the very peak of what people could hope to achieve in a career. But I always kind of wonder about the what if. What if that fork in the road had taken you in a different path? What do you always wonder about? So my final question to you today, Debbie, is that if you could exchange places with anybody in a different role, in a different career, or whatever it might be, just for a day, who would that be, and why would you choose that?
It's a really interesting one, because I think finally, I'm comfortable in who I am, and that's good. The fruit and veg industry would have had a shot had I been there,
Groceries, lower margin than video games, I'm sure.
Let's go. But no, look, I think, being brutally honest, I'm incredibly passionate about the games industry. That's what I love. That's what I'm passionate about. And so when I look at the industry, there's things there and I'm like, I wouldn't mind their job, even if it's just for a day. And so there's a couple of things there. But I think complete different industry. Oh my God, I just want to be Eminem, right? Eminem is my person. He's the coolest guy on the planet. I think everybody in the world knows at least one of his songs. So I can pick up the phone and call anybody if I'm him, and I can get so much more done. And I think, again, very left field, very different. It's not from tech. It's not entrepreneurial stuff. It's actually about what can you do in a bigger capacity. I think there is a very skilled area that all the little things that annoy me, Eminem could call those people up and fix all of it.
A very creative answer there, Debbie. I wouldn't have expected any less.
I love his music too, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast today. I've so enjoyed our chat together. And for our listeners, please do subscribe via Spotify, Apple, Google, or your usual podcast provider. And as always, please remember, nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or a solicitation to purchase securities in any company or investment product mentioned. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.